Look at your arm right now. Whatever color it is, dark, light, somewhere in between, that color is an answer to a math problem your ancestors solved with their skin over thousands of years. And for 290,000 of the roughly 300,000 years humans have existed, nobody cared. Nobody looked at another person's skin and decided it meant something about their intelligence, their character, or their right to exist. The idea that the color of your body determines your worth as a human being is one of the most powerful ideas anyone has ever invented. And it was invented. It is not natural. It is not instinct. Someone built it deliberately for a very specific reason. And the reason is not what you think. So how did humans invent racism? The answer stretches across 5 continents, 3,000 years of bad science, a few papal documents, and one rebellion in Virginia that changed everything. And it starts in your DNA. If you're enjoying the video, hit that like button and let's get into it. Let's start with what your skin actually is, because the biology is the first thing racists got wrong, and they got it wrong for centuries. Your skin color is determined by a pigment called melanin. More melanin, darker skin; less melanin, lighter skin. And the amount of melanin your body produces is controlled by at least 150 different genes. Not one gene, not 5 over 150. Sarah Tishkoff, a geneticist at the University of Pennsylvania, published a study in Science in October 2017, analyzing pigmentation genetics in 2,092 Africans from diverse populations, and found that pigmentation in Africa alone is far more genetically complex than anyone had previously understood. Some of the gene variants associated with lighter skin in African populations are hundreds of thousands of years old, predating the split between all modern human populations. And here is where this connects to the invention of racism. The people who built racial categories in the 1700s and 1800s looked at skin color and treated it like a label, a simple switch that sorted humans into 4 or 5 permanent types. The actual genetics say the opposite. Skin color is not a label. It is a gradient. It changes gradually across geography, darker near the equator, lighter near the poles, with no sharp boundaries anywhere. The scientific term for this is a cline. Julian Huxley, the British biologist, coined the word in 1938. Human skin color varies on a cline. It does not jump from one category to another at a border. It slides. And different traits, skin color, nose shape, hair texture, lactose tolerance, slide along different gradients in different directions, driven by different environmental pressures. There is no single line you can draw on a map that captures all human biological variation at once. Any racial classification has to pick some traits and ignore others, which means every racial category ever created is, by definition, arbitrary. Someone chose which differences to count and which ones to ignore. But that raises a question. If racial categories are arbitrary, why do humans keep making them? The answer starts long before anyone had a word for race. It starts with a glitch in the human brain. In 1970, a Polish-born British social psychologist named Henri Tajfel ran an experiment at the University of Bristol that should disturb you. He took a group of 14 and 15-year-old schoolboys, divided them into 2 groups based on nothing. Literally nothing. In one version of the experiment, the boys were sorted by whether they preferred paintings by Paul Klee or Wassily Kandinsky. In another version, it was a coin flip. The groups meant nothing. The boys had no history together. No rivalry, no conflict, no reason to care. And then Tajfel asked them to allocate money to anonymous members of their own group or the other group. They favored their own group. Every time, they gave more money to boys wearing their own label. And they did not just want their group to get more, they wanted the other group to get less. They would sacrifice money for their own group just to widen the gap. Tajfel published the results in the European Journal of Social Psychology in 1971 and spent the rest of his career developing what became social identity theory. The finding was simple and unsettling. You do not need history, you do not need culture, you do not need conflict. The mere act of being sorted into a category is enough to trigger favoritism. The human brain is a sorting machine. Give it any label, any division, and it will build an us and a them. Now, this is the part that connects directly to how racism was invented. That tribal instinct, that us versus them wiring, is very old. It predates our species. It exists in chimpanzees, in wolves, in almost every social animal. But here's what it is not. It is not racial. For 290,000 years, human in-group bias was based on kinship, on language, on who you personally knew. Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford published his famous paper in 1992 in the Journal of Human Evolution, showing that the human brain can maintain roughly 150 stable social relationships. Below that number, you know everyone. You govern by gossip and reputation. Your us is your band, your family, the people who share your fire. Your them is the strangers over the hill. You might fear them, you might fight them, but you are not sorting them by the color of their skin. You are sorting them by whether you recognize their face. The archaeological evidence confirms this. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a cemetery excavated by Fred Wendorf in the 1960s contained 59 skeletons dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, at least 24 showing signs of violent death. A reanalysis by Isabel Crèvecoeur, published in Scientific Reports in 2021, confirmed these were victims of repeated intergroup violence over Nile resources during drought. At Nataruk, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, a team led by Marta Mirazon-Lar of Cambridge University published findings in Nature in 2016 describing 27 individuals, roughly 10,000 years old, with skulls caved in by blunt force and obsidian arrow tips lodged in their bones. Men, women, and at least one pregnant woman. This was not a duel. This was a massacre. But nothing about the evidence suggests it was racial. These were territorial disputes, resource conflicts, group against group. The violence was real. The concept of race was not. So when did people start noticing skin color? The honest answer is they noticed it long before they weaponized it. Ancient Egyptians painted people of different skin tones on their tomb walls. The Book of Gates, found in the tomb of Pharaoh Seti I, who ruled from 1294 to 1279 BC, depicts four groups of people. Egyptians painted reddish-brown, Nubians painted dark brown, Levantines painted yellowish, Libyans painted light-skinned. Egyptologist Frank Yerko, writing in Biblical Archaeology Review in 1989, argued these were geographic categories, not a racial hierarchy. And the proof is in Egypt's own history. The 25th dynasty, roughly 747 to 656 BC, was ruled by kings from Kush in modern-day Sudan. Pharaoh Taharka, a Nubian king, ruled all of Egypt. That does not happen in a society organized around skin color hierarchy. Egypt was ethnocentric. They thought Egyptian culture was superior to everyone else's. But they did not think dark skin made you inferior. They put a dark-skinned man on the throne. The Greeks noticed physical differences too. Herodotus, writing around 440 BC, described the Ethiopians as the tallest and most beautiful of all men. That is not the language of someone who thinks dark skin is a defect. Hippocrates, around 400 BC, proposed a climate theory in his treatise Airs, Waters, and Places. He argued that climate shaped both appearance and temperament. Hot climates produced dark-skinned people. Cold climates produced light-skinned people. And here's the part that matters for the invention of racism. Hippocrates believed that if you moved someone to a different climate, their descendants would change. The differences were environmental, temporary, not permanent, not biological, not written into the soul. But Aristotle opened a door that would cause enormous damage later. In Politics, written around 350 BC, he argued that some people are natural slaves, suited by nature to be ruled. He applied this primarily to non-Greeks, people he called barbaroi, a word that originally just meant non-Greek speaking, imitating the babble of foreign languages. Historian Benjamin Isaac, in his 2004 book The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, published by Princeton University Press, calls this proto-racism. It linked geography to character. It suggested some people were born to serve. But it was not yet modern racism, because it was based on culture and climate, not on an unchangeable biological hierarchy. That invention was still 2,000 years away. Think about that for a second. From the time Aristotle wrote Politics to the time someone actually built a biological racial hierarchy, 2,000 years passed. The idea was not sitting there waiting to be discovered. It had to be constructed, and it was constructed for a very specific reason. Money? Let's skip forward. It is 1341 AD. Portuguese explorer Antão Gonçalves captures the first Africans and brings them back to Portugal as slaves. In 1444, the first large-scale slave auction in Europe takes place at Lagos, Portugal. The chronicler Gomes Aines de Zurara describes the event in his Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, completed in 1453. He writes about the enslaved Africans with a mix of pity and a justification you will hear repeated for 400 years. Their enslavement serves their spiritual salvation by bringing them to Christianity, and the Church made it official. On June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a document called Dum Diversas to King Afonso V of Portugal. It authorized the king to, and this is a direct quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. 3 years later, on January 8, 1455, the same pope issued Romanus Pontifex, extending and confirming those rights along the entire West African coast. The head of the Christian Church signed 2 documents giving one country blanket permission to enslave non-Christians. That is not ancient prejudice expressing itself. That is institutional infrastructure being built. And the question of whether colonized peoples were even fully human was debated openly. In 1550, at the Colegio de San Gregorio in Valladolid, Spain, King Charles I convened a formal debate on the rights of indigenous peoples in the Americas. On one side, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, a humanist scholar, argued that indigenous peoples were natural slaves, invoking Aristotle's concept from politics, incapable of self-governance, and that Spanish conquest was a moral duty. On the other side, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar, argued that indigenous peoples were fully rational human beings with souls and rights. No official verdict was ever issued. But the fact that it happened at all tells you something about the 1500s. The question of who counts as fully human was not settled. It was being actively constructed, in real time, by powerful men in a room arguing about whether entire populations of people deserve to exist as free beings. And that debate was not about skin color. It was about religion, civilization, and profit. The racial framework had not been built yet. But here's the thing most people miss about the early slave trade. The Portuguese did not initially enslave Africans because they were black. They enslaved them because they were available, non-Christian, and far from anyone who could stop it. The racial justification came later. It had to, because as the Atlantic slave trade grew into one of the largest forced migrations in human history, the people profiting from it needed an explanation for why this was acceptable. You cannot build an economy on human trafficking and then look at yourself in the mirror every morning without a story that makes it someone else's fault. Race was that story. In Spain, they were already practicing something similar. In 1449, the city of Toledo enacted the Sentencia Estatuto, the first Limpieza de Sangre law, purity of blood. It barred Jewish converts to Christianity from holding public office, not because of their religion, they had already converted, but because of their ancestry. Their blood was considered permanently tainted. That is a critical shift. Religious prejudice says, change your beliefs and we will accept you. Blood purity says nothing you do will ever be enough, because the problem is in your body. That logic, the logic of the body, is the engine that drives modern racism. And it was invented in the 1400s to solve a political problem in Toledo. Now here is where science became the weapon. In April 1684, a French physician named François Bernier published an article in the journal Des Sçavans titled New Division of the Earth by the Different Species or Races of Men Who Inhabit It. It was the first published attempt to classify all of humanity into distinct racial groups based on physical appearance. Bernier proposed 4 or 5 categories: Europeans, Sub-Saharan Africans, East Asians, and the Sami people of northern Scandinavia. For the first time, a European intellectual was arguing that humanity could be sorted into fundamental physical types, not by language, not by religion, not by culture, by bodies. 50 years later, Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist who created the system we still use to classify all living things, published the 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758 and divided Homo sapiens into 4 varieties. And this is where it gets ugly. He did not just describe physical differences. He assigned personality traits: Homo sapiens europaeus, white, sanguine, muscular, gentle, acute, inventive, governed by laws. Homo sapiens afer, black, phlegmatic, relaxed, crafty, indolent, negligent, governed by caprice. He took a classification system designed for plants and animals, embedded moral judgments inside it, and handed the entire package to the world as science. That is not observation. That is ideology wearing a lab coat. Then came Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in 1795 in the 3rd edition of his thesis on the natural variety of mankind. Blumenbach proposed 5 human races and invented a word you have heard 1,000 times: Caucasian. He based the term on a skull from a Georgian woman found in the Caucasus Mountains. He considered it the most beautiful skull he had ever seen and concluded that the Caucasus must have been the original homeland of humanity from which all other races had degenerated. The irony is that Blumenbach was actually less racist than most of his peers. He collected writings by people of African descent to demonstrate their intellectual abilities. But his framework, the idea that white Europeans were the original and everyone else was a degraded version, was picked up by people far less careful than he was. And it became the architecture of scientific racism for the next 2 centuries. Samuel George Morton, a Philadelphia physician, took that architecture and filled it with skulls. By the 1830s and 1840s, Morton had collected over 1,000 human crania. He filled them with lead shot, measured their volume, and published his findings in Crania Americana in 1839 and Crania Aegyptiaca in 1844. His conclusion: Caucasians had the largest brains, Africans had the smallest, and brain size determined intelligence. In 1981, Stephen Jay Gould reanalyzed Morton's data in The Mismeasure of Man and accused him of unconscious bias. In 2011, Jason Lewis and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania remeasured many of Morton's original skulls and published their findings in PLOC Biology. They found Morton's measurements were largely accurate, but they also emphasized the point that sinks Morton's entire project. Cranial capacity does not correlate with intelligence. You can measure every skull on Earth with perfect accuracy, and the numbers still tell you nothing about who is smarter than whom. The measurements were right, the conclusion was nonsense. And then Arthur de Gobineau, a French aristocrat, published his essay on the inequality of the human races between 1853 and 1855 and dropped the pretense of scientific caution entirely. Gobineau argued that the white Aryan race was superior to all others, that racial mixing caused the fall of civilizations, and that every great civilization in history had been founded by whites. His work was largely ignored in France, but in Germany, it was championed by Richard Wagner and his circle. It influenced Houston Stewart Chamberlain's 1899 book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, and that book influenced the ideology of Nazi Germany. A direct line from a French aristocrat's racial fantasy to the gas chambers of Auschwitz? Ideas have consequences, but the most revealing moment in the invention of racism did not happen in a laboratory or a library. It happened in a tobacco field in Virginia. In 1676, a man named Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion. Poor white indentured servants and enslaved black laborers fought side by side against the colonial governor. Bacon's rebellion terrified the planter class because it showed that poor whites and black slaves could unite against the people exploiting both of them. And the solution was racial law. After the rebellion, Virginia's legislature systematically drove a wedge between poor whites and black people. In 1691, Virginia banned interracial marriage. In 1705, the Virginia slave codes consolidated racial laws defining all non-Christian servants brought into the colony as permanent slaves and granting poor whites legal superiority over all black people, regardless of wealth. The planter elite gave poor whites just enough status to stop them from allying with the people they actually had the most in common with. Historian Barbara Fields at Columbia University put it plainly in a 1990 essay in New Left Review. Racism was invented to justify slavery, not the other way around. The exploitation came first, the ideology came second. The plantation owners needed cheap labor, they got it from Africa. They needed a story that explained why this was acceptable. They built one, and they built it so well that 400 years later, most people still think the categories are natural. Thomas Jefferson understood this contradiction and lived inside it. In Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, he wrote, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind." He also wrote that slavery was morally wrong. He said he supported eventual emancipation, and he enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. DNA evidence, published in Nature in 1998 by Eugene Foster and colleagues, confirmed that Jefferson almost certainly fathered children with Sally Hemings, a woman he owned, who was also the half-sister of his deceased wife. The man who wrote "All men are created equal" needed a racial ideology to explain why he kept human beings as property. That is what racism does. It turns a contradiction into a system. And then, in the 20th century, science finally caught up with what should have been obvious all along. In 1912, Franz Boas, a German-born anthropologist at Columbia University, published a study that pulled the first thread. He had measured the head shapes of 17,821 immigrants and their American-born children in New York City. He found that children born in America had different skull shapes than their parents from Europe. Round-headed Eastern European Jewish immigrants had children with longer heads. Long-headed Sicilian immigrants had children with rounder heads. The supposedly fixed, permanent racial marker of skull shape changed in a single generation based on environment. The foundation of racial science cracked. And here is something that shows you exactly how deep the constructed categories go. In the 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark gave black children aged 3 to 7 a simple choice: a white doll or a black doll. A majority of the black children preferred the white doll. They called it nice and good. They called the black doll bad. Children who had barely learned to speak had already absorbed the racial hierarchy that adults had spent centuries building. The Clarks published their findings in the Journal of Social Psychology in 1947, and the research was cited in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision as evidence that segregation psychologically harmed black children. Think about what that means for the invention of racism. A system invented by adults for economic reasons had burrowed so deep into the culture that 3-year-olds were reproducing it without anyone having to teach them directly. That is not biology. That is engineering. Richard Lewontin, a geneticist at Harvard, drove a truck through the crack in 1972. In a paper called The Apportionment of Human Diversity, published in Evolutionary Biology, Lewontin analyzed 17 genetic markers across populations worldwide. He found that 85.4% of all human genetic variation exists within local populations, within a single ethnic group. Only 6.3% of variation exists between the major racial categories. Pick 2 random people from the same race, and the genetic difference between them is nearly as large as the difference between 2 random people from different races. The categories are not capturing real biological boundaries. They are drawing lines on a gradient. The Human Genome Project confirmed it. When the project was declared complete on April 14, 2003, the findings were unambiguous. All humans share roughly 99.9% of their DNA. Craig Venter, who led the private genome effort, said it directly: the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. And in 2002, Noah Rosenberg and colleagues published a study in Science analyzing 377 genetic markers in 56 individuals from 52 populations worldwide. Within population variation accounted for 93 to 95% of total genetic variation. The boundaries between supposed racial groups were not sharp lines. They were wide, blurry gradients that overlapped across entire continents. And the skin color question that started this whole mess was answered definitively. Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin published a study in the Journal of Human Evolution in 2000 showing that human skin color correlates almost perfectly with ultraviolet radiation levels at different latitudes. Dark skin evolved near the equator to protect folate from UV damage. Light skin evolved at higher latitudes to allow enough UV through for vitamin D synthesis. In 2005, Keith Cheng at Penn State identified the SLC24A5 gene variant responsible for roughly 25 to 38% of the pigmentation difference between Europeans and West Africans. And here's the fact that should rewrite everything. DNA from a 7,000-year-old skeleton found at Labrana Cave in Spain, analyzed by Carles Loyuza Fox and published in Nature in 2014, showed that this ancient European had dark skin and blue eyes. In 2018, analysis of Cheddar Man, a 10,000-year-old skeleton from England, showed dark to dark brown skin and blue eyes. Light skin in Europe is roughly 10,000 years old. The people who built the racial categories of the 1700s thought skin color was ancient and permanent. It is recent, and it is still changing. So here's the answer. How did humans invent racism? They did it in stages. First, the human brain evolved a tribal instinct, an us versus them sorting mechanism that helped small groups of hunter-gatherers survive by favoring the familiar and fearing the stranger. That instinct is real. It is old, and it is not racial. For 290,000 years, it operated on kinship, language, and personal recognition, not on skin color. Then, ancient civilizations noticed physical differences between peoples and explained them through climate theory. The idea that geography shaped the body. Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Islamic scholars all described human variation, but they treated it as environmental, not as a permanent biological hierarchy. Aristotle introduced the concept of natural slavery, but even that was rooted in culture, not biology. Then, starting in the 1400s, the Atlantic slave trade created an economic system that required millions of human beings to be treated as property. The people profiting from that system needed a justification that went beyond religion, because enslaved people could convert, and beyond culture because culture can change. They needed something permanent, something written into the body. So they invented biological race. They hired scientists to measure skulls and rank civilizations. They passed laws that turned skin color into legal status. They built a theology that reinterpreted scripture to justify bondage. And they constructed a world in which the categories felt so natural that most people forgot they were constructed at all. Was racism inevitable? The tribal instinct, the tendency to favor the familiar, that appears to be hardwired. The probability that humans would develop some form of in-group bias is essentially 100%. But the specific invention of biological racism, The idea that skin color determines intelligence, character, and human worth, that was not inevitable. It was a product of specific historical, economic, and political conditions, primarily the Atlantic slave trade and European colonialism. The probability that this particular form of racism would have emerged without those economic structures is low, roughly 10 to 15%. Other civilizations had prejudice, ethnocentrism, and caste systems, but none of them independently produced the systematic biological racial hierarchy that Europe exported to the world starting in the 1600s. Racism in its modern form was not discovered. It was manufactured by specific people, for specific reasons, and the receipts are in the historical record. The American Anthropological Association said it plainly in their 1998 statement on race. Present-day inequalities between so-called racial groups are not consequences of their biological inheritance, but products of historical and contemporary social, economic, educational, and political circumstances. We built an entire global system of hierarchy around a vitamin D problem. We measured skulls and wrote laws, and fought wars and enslaved millions of human beings over a trait controlled by 150 genes that changes on a gradient with the angle of the sun. And every genome sequenced, every skeleton analyzed, every study published says the same thing. The categories were invented, the science was manufactured, and the system built on top of them was designed from the beginning to benefit the people who built it. Tonight, wherever you are, your skin is doing exactly what it evolved to do: regulating vitamin D, protecting folate, responding to the latitude your ancestors lived at for thousands of years. It is doing chemistry. It has never, not once, determined your intelligence, your character, or your worth as a human being. The only reason anyone ever thought it did is because 500 years ago, some very powerful people needed a story to justify a very profitable crime. And they told that story so well and for so long that it started to feel like the truth. It was never the truth. It was always an invention. And that might be the most important thing about racism. If someone built it, someone can take it apart. Now tell us in the comments, what should we try next? And go watch the video appearing on your screen right now.